In the deepening dusk of Alexandria, 47 BCE, 13 men gather in a small room behind a potter's workshop. The air is thick with the scent of clay and salt from the nearby Mediterranean. You might have passed this building 100 times, never knowing what transpired within its unremarkable walls. Oil lamps flicker, casting elongated shadows across faces, neither distinguished by wealth nor power. These are not the men who command armies or dictate policy in the royal court. They are merchants, scribes, a physician, a shipbuilder, ordinary men by all appearances. Yet they sit in perfect formation, arranged in a pattern that would, if viewed from above, suggest the constellation Orion. The silence between them has weight, texture, purpose. It is a silence they have cultivated over years of practice, a silence that speaks its own language. The eldest among them, a man with hands calloused from decades of transcribing texts in the great library, finally breaks this silence. His words emerge not as a shout, but as a whisper, almost indistinguishable from the gentle lapping of waves against the harbor walls outside. "We are the vessels," he begins, and the others respond in unison, through which knowledge flows, unbroken. This is not dramatic. This is not revolutionary. There is no blood oath, no dramatic proclamation of world-changing intent. It is, in its way, bureaucratic, the quiet foundation of something designed to endure beyond any individual lifetime. They call themselves the custodes cognitionis, the keepers of knowledge. In later centuries, they would be known by other names, in other languages, but always with the same essential meaning. The founding principle was simple. Knowledge, once found, should never again be lost. Alexandria's library, the greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world, had already suffered one devastating fire. These men, who spent their days among its scrolls and tablets, had recognized a fundamental fragility in how human knowledge was preserved. Stone crumbles, papyrus burns, memory fades, but a network, carefully maintained through generations, might preserve what physical repositories could not. Their methodology was equally straightforward. Each member would memorize a portion of a text, not just its words, but its meaning and context. Each would select and train an apprentice, usually a son or nephew, though sometimes a promising student with no relation. Each would learn to recognize others of their brotherhood through a series of innocuous phrases and responses that could be embedded in normal conversation, and each would carry, somewhere on their person, a small clay token bearing the stylized image of a lamp, a symbol so common it would raise no suspicions. The room where they gathered was not adorned with mystical symbols or arcane artifacts. It contained simple wooden benches, the oil lamps, a table bearing a clay vessel of watered wine. The room's plainness was deliberate, nothing to attract attention, nothing to suggest that anything of consequence occurred there. Even the timing of their meetings followed no strict calendar, but was determined by ordinary events, market days, religious festivals, the arrivals and departures of merchant ships, patterns within patterns, hidden in the fabric of everyday life. As night deepened around the 13 men, they began the work that would occupy their brotherhood for millennia to come. Each recited their portion of knowledge, segments of astronomical observations, mathematical theorems, medical techniques, philosophical arguments, historical accounts. The others listened, corrected, questioned. This was not mystical communion, but methodical verification, ensuring that what was carried in memory remained accurate. Outside, Alexandria continued its nocturnal rhythms. Sailors called to one another as they secured their vessels for the night. Traders counted the day's earnings. Priests prepared for morning rituals. None noticed the unremarkable men who eventually emerged from the potter's workshop, departing individually, returning to lives that appeared entirely conventional. This was the first night of what would become the longest surviving secret society in human history. Not born in thunder and lightning, not announced with manifestos or declarations, but established with the quiet persistence of those who take the long view. They did not seek to rule empires or amass wealth. Their ambition was both more modest and more audacious, to create an unbroken line of human memory that could survive the rise and fall of civilizations. In the years that followed, as Caesar's civil war engulfed the Roman world, as Cleopatra navigated the treacherous politics of a dying republic, the custodes continued their work without interruption. When the great library burned again during Caesar's Alexandrian campaign, the Brotherhood preserved hundreds of texts that would otherwise have been lost forever. Not the entirety of the library's vast collection, such a feat would have been impossible, but carefully selected works of particular value or vulnerability. Their methods evolved with experience. They developed a system of distributed memorization, where no single member held a complete text, but rather a portion that, when combined with others, would reconstruct the whole. They created mnemonic techniques that allowed them to retain vast amounts of information with extraordinary fidelity. They established recognition protocols that could work across language barriers and cultural divides. By 30 BCE, when Octavian conquered Egypt and established Roman rule, the Brotherhood had spread beyond Alexandria. Small cells existed in Rome itself, in Athens, in Pergamon, in Carthage, in Jerusalem, each maintaining the same disciplined silence, the same methodical approach to their mission. They communicated through traveling members and coded references in commercial correspondence, references so subtly embedded that even if intercepted, they appeared as nothing more than conventional business discussions. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE might have destroyed countless other organizations, but the custodes had been designed from the outset to survive such cataclysms. As Roman administration collapsed, as cities were abandoned or sacked, as literacy itself became increasingly rare in the West, the Brotherhood adapted. In some regions they shifted from written to purely oral transmission. In others, they integrated with emerging monastic traditions, becoming scribes and scholars within religious institutions, while maintaining their separate identity and purpose. During the Byzantine period, a cell of the custodes operated within the imperial library in Constantinople. They wore the administrative robes of ordinary court functionaries, attended the same churches, participated in the same ceremonies as their non-initiated colleagues. Yet twice monthly, they would gather in a small, unremarkable room near the Hagia Sophia, where they continued the practices established 5 centuries earlier in Alexandria. The rhythm of their meetings remained unchanged. The silence, the recitation, the verification, the faces and languages changed, but the purpose endured. When texts were threatened by theological disputes or imperial decrees, copies would be made, not always on parchment or paper, which could be discovered and destroyed, but in memory, preserved through the Brotherhood's techniques, and distributed across multiple members. In the Islamic world, during what Europe called the Dark Ages, the custodes found particularly fertile ground. The emphasis on knowledge and learning during the early caliphates allowed them to operate more openly, though still without revealing their true nature. Many became associated with the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, or similar institutions in Cordoba and Cairo. They translated Greek and Latin texts into Arabic, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost to Europe. Their presence in medieval Europe was more circumspect. The Catholic Church's occasional hostility to classical learning required careful navigation. Some custodes joined monastic orders, particularly the Benedictines, whose emphasis on scholarship provided cover for their activities. Others became physicians, whose need for ancient medical knowledge justified their interest in otherwise suspicious texts. Still others operated as merchants, using trade networks to maintain connections between widely scattered cells. The brotherhood's structure evolved over centuries to maintain both security and effectiveness. No central leadership existed that could be targeted or corrupted. Each cell operated autonomously, connected to others through a system of verification and cross-reference. If a cell was compromised or died out, as occasionally happened during plagues, wars, or persecutions, its knowledge had already been distributed among multiple other cells, ensuring nothing was permanently lost. By the time of the Renaissance, the custodes had been operating continuously for 15 centuries. Their methods had been refined, their security protocols tested by time and circumstance. They had survived the fall of Rome, the Byzantine Sassanid Wars, the rise of Islam, the Crusades, the Mongol invasions, the Black Death. They had preserved knowledge through famines and floods, through religious upheavals and political revolutions. And yet, for all this extraordinary longevity, they remained virtually unknown outside their own ranks. This was by design. They kept no central archives that could be discovered. They created no buildings or monuments that would attract attention. They displayed no identifying emblems beyond the simple lamp token, which to outsiders appeared as nothing more than a common good luck charm. The Brotherhood's history was preserved like everything else, in memory, distributed across members, recalled and verified through their established practices. This invisibility was perhaps their greatest achievement. In a world obsessed with fame and legacy, they had created an organization dedicated to knowledge rather than to its possessors. Individual members were important only insofar as they fulfilled their function as vessels of preservation. Their names were rarely recorded, their individual contributions seldom distinguished from the collective work. And so the rhythm continued. Millennium after millennium, the silence, the recitation, the verification. Faces changed, languages evolved, civilizations rose and fell, but the purpose remained constant, to ensure that knowledge, once found, would never again be lost. In a small room in Florence, 1446, 13 men gather. The air smells of ink and candle wax. They sit in the Orion pattern, as their predecessors have for nearly 1500 years. The silence settles between them, familiar and purposeful. The eldest speaks, "We are the vessels," and the others respond, through which knowledge flows, unbroken. Outside, the Renaissance blooms. Artists and scholars rediscover classical knowledge, marveling at its preservation through the Dark Ages. Few recognize the quiet brotherhood that helped ensure these discoveries were possible, the network of memory that bridged the centuries when physical texts were burned, buried, or forgotten. This is how silence preserves what noise would destroy. This is how patience outlasts power. This is how knowledge survives when its physical vessels, books, buildings, bodies, inevitably succumb to time. Constantinople, 1453. The city falls to Ottoman forces after a millennium as the capital of the Byzantine Empire. Amid the chaos of conquest, 7 men, outwardly merchants, scholars, and minor officials, slip away separately, carrying nothing that would mark them as exceptional. Each has memorized a portion of texts deemed too sensitive to commit to writing, texts that might not survive the transition from Christian to Muslim rule. They travel along different routes, one to Venice, one to Genoa, one to Dubrovnik, 2 northward toward Kiev, 2 eastward toward Trebizond. None carries identifying documents connecting them to the others. Yet, within 8 months, all 7 will have made contact with established custode cells in their destination cities. The knowledge they carry will be verified against existing records, integrated into the Brotherhood's distributed memory, and preserved. 4 of the 7 will never return to Constantinople. 2 will return under new identities. 1 will return openly, having secured a position in the new Ottoman administration. This pattern dispersion, preservation, reintegration had been refined through centuries of political upheavals, but the fall of Constantinople marked a turning point for the Brotherhood in another way. The resulting exodus of Byzantine scholars to Western Europe, carrying ancient manuscripts and knowledge, accelerated what we now call the Renaissance. For perhaps the first time since its founding, the custodes found themselves in a world increasingly eager for the very knowledge they had been preserving. It would have been natural, perhaps, for them to step forward and claim recognition for their centuries of work, but this was not their way. Instead, they adapted to this new intellectual environment while maintaining their essential secrecy. Many became printers, positions that allowed them to ensure important texts were published and distributed widely. Others became professors at the newly established universities, where they could guide scholarship without revealing their affiliation. Still others became private tutors to noble families, quietly influencing the education of future leaders. In Venice, 1489, a manuscript dealer named Ermolao Barbaro receives a visitor in his cluttered shop near the Rialto Bridge. The visitor, a Portuguese merchant, inquires about texts related to ancient navigation techniques. Their conversation seems unremarkable, one of dozens Barbaro might have in a day, but certain phrases are exchanged that identify both men as custodes. No dramatic recognition occurs, no secret handshakes or cryptic symbols. Just a slight shift in the conversation's rhythm, an imperceptible relaxation in posture. The Portuguese merchant is planning an expedition to the Indies. He seeks navigational knowledge preserved by the Brotherhood, knowledge derived from ancient Phoenician, Greek, and Arab sources. Barbaro provides him not with physical texts, those would be too vulnerable to loss at sea, but with mnemonic structures that will allow him to recall complex astronomical calculations and tidal patterns. These are techniques developed by the custodes over centuries, refinements of the memory systems used by ancient orators, adapted specifically for preserving technical knowledge. 2 years later, this same merchant will serve as navigator on a voyage that reaches lands unknown to European powers. The knowledge he carries, preserved through the Brotherhood's methods, will never appear in the official reports sent back to Lisbon, but it will be shared with other custodes at ports along newly established trade routes, creating nodes in a network that spans a rapidly expanding known world. This period of European expansion presented both opportunities and challenges for the Brotherhood. The opportunity to spread their network globally was counterbalanced by the risk of overextension and fragmentation. Communication between cells became more difficult across oceanic distances. Cultural differences between European custodes and potential initiates in the Americas, Africa, and Asia created new complexities in maintaining the Brotherhood's protocols. Yet, the fundamental principles established in Alexandria 15 centuries earlier proved remarkably adaptable. The emphasis on memorization rather than written documentation allowed the Brotherhood's practices to transcend literacy barriers. The focus on practical knowledge, navigation, mathematics, medicine, agriculture provided value that could be recognized across cultural divides. The deliberately minimal organizational structure prevented the imposition of European perspectives on non-European cells. By the early 17th century, custode cells existed on every continent known to European powers. Each maintained autonomy while adhering to the core practices: the silence, the recitation, the verification. Knowledge flowed in multiple directions. Ancient Greek medical techniques preserved by European cells were exchanged for Aztec botanical knowledge preserved by cells in New Spain, which in turn was exchanged for Chinese astronomical observations preserved by cells in Manila. This global network operated beneath the notice of imperial authorities, religious hierarchies, and academic institutions. The Brotherhood had no interest in challenging established power structures directly. Their mission remained what it had always been: preservation, not revolution. Yet, the knowledge they maintained and exchanged inevitably influenced the world around them, often in ways that would not become apparent for generations. In London, 1660, a group of natural philosophers establishes what will become the Royal Society. Several founding members are custodes, though this connection remains unknown to their colleagues. Their experiences with the Brotherhood's methods of verification and cross-reference influence the development of what will later be called the scientific method. The emphasis on empirical observation, replicable experiments, and peer review echoes practices the custodes had been refining since Alexandria. The Brotherhood's relationship with emerging scientific institutions was complex. On one hand, these institutions represented the public flourishing of values the custodes had long maintained: the importance of knowledge, the necessity of methodical verification, the value of preservation and transmission. On the other hand, the increasingly public and documented nature of scientific discourse ran counter to the Brotherhood's tradition of secrecy and memorization. Some custodes argued for a gradual revelation of their existence, a merger with these new scientific societies. Others insisted that the Brotherhood's methods and accumulated knowledge remained vulnerable to political and religious interference, that public institutions would inevitably compromise under pressure. This tension was never fully resolved, leading to a kind of dual approach: participation in public scientific discourse, while maintaining the separate secret structure of the Brotherhood. Throughout the Enlightenment, this pattern continued. Custodes members held positions in universities, scientific societies, and increasingly in government bureaucracies and colonial administrations. They contributed to public knowledge while preserving the more sensitive or controversial material within the Brotherhood's traditional memory systems. They established new cells in colonial capitals and trading ports, extending their network alongside, but distinct from, the expansion of European empires. The Industrial Revolution brought new challenges. The pace of technological change accelerated beyond what the Brotherhood's methods had been designed to accommodate. Knowledge became increasingly specialized, making it difficult for individual members to maintain the broad understanding that had characterized earlier generations of custodes. The growth of mass literacy and public education reduced the distinctiveness of the Brotherhood's preservation role. Yet they adapted, as they had so many times before. The focus shifted from preserving knowledge that might otherwise be lost to preserving connections between increasingly compartmentalized fields of knowledge. Custodes who were mathematicians maintained connections with custodes who were physicians, who maintained connections with custodes who were botanists, who maintained connections with custodes who were anthropologists. The Brotherhood became a network of interdisciplinary understanding in an age of growing specialization. In Boston, 1847, a customs official named Nathaniel Hawthorne sits at his desk reviewing shipping manifests. His work is tedious, but allows him time to write. He has already published several short stories and is working on longer fiction. What is not known, what will never appear in any biography, is that Hawthorne is also a member of the Custodes. His position gives him access to correspondence networks that connect brotherhood cells across the Atlantic world. His literary talents are employed in encoding messages within seemingly innocuous letters about family matters or business concerns. Hawthorne represents a shift in how the brotherhood operated in the modern age, where earlier generations of custodes had focused primarily on preserving specific bodies of knowledge. 19th century members increasingly functioned as connection points in global information networks. They facilitated the movement of knowledge across political borders, between academic disciplines, through social classes. They became, in a sense, human hyperlinks in an era before digital connectivity. This shift accelerated during the colonial era, as European powers established bureaucratic control over vast territories in Africa and Asia. Custodes members often found positions within these administrations, not at the highest levels that would attract too much attention, but in the middle ranks, where documents flowed and connections could be maintained. They served as district officers, translators, surveyors, medical officers, and similar roles that provided both mobility and access to information. What made these colonial-era custodes particularly significant was their frequent role as bridges between European systems and indigenous knowledge networks. Many made efforts to identify and initiate local scholars, healers, and knowledge keepers into the brotherhood, recognizing that colonial regimes often threatened traditional knowledge systems, just as earlier political upheavals had threatened knowledge in Alexandria or Constantinople. Through these initiations, the custodes incorporated techniques for preserving oral histories, botanical knowledge, astronomical observations, and cultural practices that might otherwise have been dismissed by European scientific institutions as superstition or folklore. This knowledge was preserved through the Brotherhood's traditional methods: memorization, recitation, verification, and distributed across the global network. In Delhi, 1887, a British medical officer meets monthly with 12 others, 3 fellow British officials, 4 Indian scholars, 2 Persian merchants, a Chinese diplomat, a Japanese exchange student, and an Egyptian engineer. They gather in a small room behind a bookshop near the old city walls. Their discussions move fluidly between English, Urdu, Persian, and occasionally Latin when precision requires it. They sit in the Orion pattern, though none would explicitly acknowledge this arrangement. The silence settles between them, familiar and purposeful. The eldest speaks. We are the vessels, and the others respond, through which knowledge flows, unbroken. This scene, repeated with variations across the colonial world, represented both continuity with the Brotherhood's ancient practices and adaptation to modern circumstances. The multi-ethnic, multilingual composition of many colonial-era cells reflected the increasingly global nature of knowledge exchange. The continued emphasis on memorization and oral transmission maintains security in an age of increasing surveillance. The preservation of indigenous knowledge, alongside European scientific learning, fulfilled the original mission of ensuring that valuable understanding would not be lost to political or cultural upheaval. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the Custodes faced perhaps their greatest challenges since the fall of Rome. 2 world wars disrupted their networks, scattered their members, and threatened the knowledge they had preserved. The rise of totalitarian regimes with sophisticated surveillance capabilities made traditional meeting patterns dangerous in many regions. The development of nuclear weapons created the possibility of destruction on a scale the Brotherhood had never contemplated, yet even in this environment, the custodes persisted. During the Nazi regime, Jewish members of German and Eastern European cells preserved cultural and scientific knowledge that was being systematically erased. During the Stalin era, Soviet custodes maintained connections to the wider Brotherhood, despite the risks of being labeled foreign agents. During the Cold War, cells on both sides of the Iron Curtain preserved channels of communication disconnected from official diplomatic or espionage networks. What none of them realized, what would only become apparent in retrospect, was that their activities had not gone entirely unnoticed. The very adaptations that allowed the Brotherhood to survive in the modern age, their placement in bureaucratic systems, their cross-border connections, their preservation of knowledge outside official channels, had begun to attract attention from a new type of organization, intelligence agencies. In Washington, 1947, as the Central Intelligence Agency is formally established, a senior analyst includes a brief, enigmatic note in a foundational memorandum on intelligence gathering priorities: identify and monitor persistent, non-state knowledge networks with historical continuity. The note receives little attention amid more pressing Cold War concerns. It is filed, cross-referenced, and temporarily forgotten, but not permanently. The paper trail had begun. Langley, Virginia, 1986. In a windowless office, deep within CIA headquarters, an analyst sits alone, surrounded by stacks of paper that seem to grow rather than diminish, despite 18 straight hours of review. The fluorescent lights emit a steady hum that has become white noise, punctuated only by the occasional click of the wall clock, marking another hour past. The room smells of cold coffee, printer toner, and the faint chemical scent of highlighter markers. The analyst, let's call them Morgan, though that isn't their real name, has been assigned what appeared initially to be a routine historical review. The Cold War is entering its final years, though of course Morgan doesn't know this yet. What landed on their desk 3 weeks ago was a directive to examine patterns in Soviet academic exchanges over the past 40 years, looking for evidence of intelligence gathering disguised as scholarly cooperation. A straightforward counterintelligence task, or so it seemed, but as Morgan methodically worked through thousands of pages of surveillance reports, academic publications, conference attendance lists, and diplomatic cables, something unexpected emerged. Not Soviet intelligence activity, though there was plenty of that, but hints of another network operating beneath the surface of official exchanges. The pattern was subtle, almost certainly unintentional. Individual academics, Soviet, American, British, French, Chinese, Indian, who appeared repeatedly in different contexts. Never the conference organizers or prominent speakers, never the ones quoted in newspapers or receiving major grants. Middle-tier researchers, administrators, translators, people who facilitated rather than headlined. What caught Morgan's attention was that these individuals often maintained correspondence across ideological lines that should have been difficult during the height of Cold War tensions. A Soviet botanist and an American ecologist exchanging letters about Siberian plant classifications throughout the 1960s, even as broader scientific cooperation collapsed. A Chinese archaeologist and a British historian maintaining contact via academic journals, despite the Cultural Revolution's disruption of international scholarly networks. None of these connections had been flagged as intelligence-related by previous analysts. The content of the exchanges appeared genuinely academic, lacking the markers typically associated with coded communications. Yet, the persistence of these connections across political divides suggested something organized, something purposeful. Now, surrounded by paper in the quiet of early morning, Morgan runs a hand through disheveled hair and reaches for the cold remnants of coffee in a CIA mug. On the desk, a yellow legal pad contains a sprawling diagram connecting individuals across time and space. Red for Soviet bloc, blue for Western, green for non-aligned nations. Lines connecting them based on documented interactions. Circles indicating academic disciplines. The pattern shouldn't exist. By all logic of Cold War divisions, these connections should have been severed by political pressures, by security concerns, by the fundamental suspicion that characterized East-West relations. Yet they persisted, adapting to changing circumstances, but maintaining a consistent underlying structure. Morgan reaches for another file, this one retrieved from deep storage after 3 separate security authorization requests. It contains surveillance reports on academic conferences in Vienna during the 1950s, a neutral meeting ground where scholars from both sides of the Iron Curtain could interact. The reports focus primarily on known or suspected intelligence operatives, but in the background, in the margins of attention, the same pattern emerges: the facilitators, the connectors, the ones who moved between different delegations, with a comfort that suggested familiarity beyond the confines of the conference itself. The war clock clicks forward another hour. Morning light would be appearing outside, though none penetrates this interior room. Morgan stretches, feeling the stiffness of too many hours in the same position. The diagram on the legal pad has grown more complex, with temporal connections now adding a third dimension to the spatial ones. Certain names reappear across decades, not the same individuals, but successors, students, colleagues, who seem to inherit not just academic positions, but connection patterns. This is where the analytical challenge intensifies. Intelligence work fundamentally involves distinguishing signal from noise, pattern from coincidence. The human mind is designed to find connections, to create narratives that explain observed phenomena. But this same tendency leads to false positives, to seeing conspiracies where there is only chance alignment. Morgan is aware of this cognitive pitfall. 12 years of intelligence analysis has instilled a healthy skepticism toward emerging patterns, particularly those that suggest long-term, coordinated activities undetected by previous investigations. And yet the pattern persists, refuses to dissolve under scrutiny. Reaching for a fresh legal pad, Morgan begins a methodical evaluation of alternative explanations. Could this simply reflect the natural tendency of academic disciplines to maintain international connections despite political tensions? Possible, but the cross-disciplinary nature of the network argues against this. Could it be an already known intelligence operation that was compartmentalized, its full scope hidden from regular analysts? Unlikely given the temporal consistency across changing intelligence priorities. Could it be nothing at all, just a statistical anomaly? A pattern emerged from random data points. Morgan stares at this question for a long time, tapping a pen against the desk in an unconscious rhythm. The analyst in Morgan wants this to be the answer. It would be the cleanest explanation, requiring no revision of existing intelligence frameworks, but something deeper, more intuitive, rebels against this dismissal. There are too many connections, too many adaptations that suggest purposeful continuation rather than chance alignment. And there's something else, a peculiar consistency in how these individuals operate. They leave minimal documentary evidence. They maintain connections through seemingly innocuous communications. They occupy positions that provide access without attracting attention. These are tradecraft principles, but not applied in service of traditional espionage objectives. If this network exists, it doesn't appear to be gathering military secrets, influencing policy decisions, or engaging in any of the activities that intelligence services typically monitor. Its purpose remains obscure. The clock clicks forward again. Morgan should go home, shower, sleep, return with fresh eyes. But the pattern has become an intellectual itch that demands scratching, pushing aside the legal pads and modern surveillance reports. Morgan turns to an older file, one requested on a hunch 3 days ago. This file contains materials from the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, predecessor to the CIA, during World War II. Specifically, it details a 1943 investigation into academic networks that maintained connections between Allied and Axis countries prior to the war. The investigation was never completed, interrupted by more urgent wartime priorities, that the fragmentary reports contain observations strikingly similar to Morgan's current analysis. Academics, who maintained correspondence despite political hostilities, individuals who occupied mid-level positions in universities, publishing houses, research institutes, a pattern of connection that transcended national and ideological boundaries. The OSS investigator, whose name is redacted, noted these patterns with the same mixture of professional skepticism and intuitive certainty that Morgan now feels. And there, on the final page of the incomplete report, a reference that sends Morgan reaching for the computer terminal. A cross-reference to an even earlier investigation, this one conducted by British intelligence in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution. Morgan types a request for this file, knowing it will take days or weeks to locate and transfer from British archives, if it still exists at all. The clock clicks forward. Morgan's eyes burn from fatigue. The diagram on the legal pad has become a complex web of connections spanning continents and decades. At the bottom of the page, a question written and underlined twice. How old is this network? And below that, a note added, in a moment of either insight or exhaustion-induced fancy. What are they preserving? Because that's the pattern that has emerged from all these disparate data points. Not espionage in any traditional sense, not political influence, but preservation of knowledge, of connections, of something that transcends the temporal boundaries of political regimes and ideological conflicts. Morgan stares at this note, feeling the vertigo that comes from glimpsing potentially greater depths below what was thought to be the bottom. If this pattern extends back before the Cold War, before World War II, before the Russian Revolution, how far back might it go? What might its origins be? And why has it never been comprehensively investigated? The last question has a potentially disturbing answer. Perhaps it has been, and those investigations were themselves suppressed or forgotten. This thought leads down a rabbit hole of paranoid speculation that Morgan's training immediately flags as dangerous. Occam's razor suggests a simpler explanation. The pattern has been periodically noticed, but dismissed as insignificant because it doesn't align with traditional security threats. Morgan, the voice from the doorway, startles the analyst, who looks up to see a colleague, Davis from the Soviet desk, standing with 2 fresh coffees. You look like hell. Been here all night? Morgan nods, accepting the coffee with a grateful gesture. Lost track of time. Davis glances at the stacks of materials, the sprawling diagram. Making progress. How to answer that question? Morgan opts for bureaucratic understatement. Found some interesting patterns. Need to determine if they're significant. Davis nods, uninterested in details outside their area of responsibility. Well, don't burn yourself out. These historical reviews always take longer than they allocate. After Davis leaves, Morgan sips the fresh coffee and considers next steps. The responsible approach would be to document the pattern, acknowledge its uncertain significance, and submit a report recommending limited further investigation as resources permit. Standard procedure for low priority, non-time sensitive intelligence matters, but something about this pattern demands more. Not just professional thoroughness, but a deeper, almost personal need to understand. Morgan realizes with a start that this feeling itself mirrors what the pattern suggests about the network, a commitment to knowledge that transcends institutional priorities. The clock clicks forward. Morgan makes a decision. The official report will follow protocol, measured, cautious, emphasizing the limited evidence and alternative explanations. But alongside this, Morgan will maintain a separate, unofficial investigation, requesting files that seem tangential to current assignments, having conversations with colleagues in historical analysis, in academic liaison positions, in long-term strategic assessment. This mirrors what Morgan suspects about the network itself, operating within established systems, but maintaining a separate, parallel purpose. The irony of this symmetry is not lost on the exhausted analyst. One final note goes onto the legal pad before Morgan finally powers down the computer and prepares to leave, not what they know, but how they preserve it. This becomes the central question of Morgan's unofficial investigation, the thread that will lead through decades of intelligence archives and centuries of historical records. Not the specific knowledge this potential network maintains, though that remains intriguing, but the methods by which they've apparently preserved both information and organizational continuity across political upheavals, technological revolutions, and cultural transformations. In the months that follow, Morgan's official workload continues. Soviet academic networks give way to analyses of Eastern European transition governments as the Cold War winds down. But the unofficial investigation persists, occupying evenings and weekends, becoming something between a professional hobby and an intellectual obsession. The British file eventually arrives incomplete, water-damaged from a 1957 archive flood, but containing enough to confirm that the pattern Morgan identified had been noticed over 70 years earlier. More significantly, the British investigator made reference to even earlier suspicions, dating back to the Napoleonic era, when both British and French intelligence services noted academics who maintained correspondence despite the continental blockade. This sends Morgan deeper into historical archives, beyond the typical scope of intelligence analysis, and into the realm of historical research. The CIA maintains extensive historical records, not just of its own operations, but of predecessor organizations and allied services going back centuries. Access to these archives requires creative justification, but Morgan becomes adept at finding official pretexts for historical inquiries. The pattern continues to emerge further back in time. Dutch intelligence reports from the late 18th century, noting correspondence networks that survived political shifts, Vatican observations of scholarly connections that transcended religious divisions during the Reformation, Venetian diplomatic records, noting academics who maintained connections between Christian and Ottoman territories. With each temporal jump backward, the evidence becomes more fragmentary, more circumstantial. Morgan is acutely aware that the further back one goes, the easier it becomes to impose modern patterns on limited historical data, and yet the consistency is striking. Individuals operating in similar positions, maintaining similar types of connections, adapting to changing circumstances, while preserving what appears to be a core purpose. The question of how old this network might be takes on a vertiginous quality. If it can be traced back centuries with the limited evidence available, could its origins be truly ancient? Could it have survived from classical times, through the Dark Ages, through every political and religious upheaval of Western civilization? From an intelligence perspective, such historical depth would be unprecedented. Known secret societies and esoteric organizations rarely survive more than a few generations with their original purposes intact. They fragment, evolve, are co-opted by political movements or religious institutions. The idea of an organization maintaining its core function across millennia strains credulity, and yet the pattern persists. Morgan finds references in Byzantine records to scholarly networks maintaining connections across religious divides, references in Islamic Golden Age texts to knowledge preservation systems independent of political authorities, fragmentary evidence in Roman records of scholarly connections that survived political transitions. The clock in Morgan's office continues its steady rhythm, marking hours that stretch into months of investigation. The diagram on the legal pad has been transferred to a secure database, growing more complex as new connections emerge. The question at the bottom remains unchanged. What are they preserving? But Morgan has begun to formulate an answer, one that emerges not from any single piece of evidence, but from the pattern itself. They are preserving not just specific knowledge, though that appears to be part of their function, but methods of preservation. They are a metasystem, designed to ensure that knowledge survives the very processes that typically destroy it: political collapse, religious transformation, technological revolution. This hypothesis would explain their remarkable adaptability across historical contexts. It would explain why they've never emerged as a public institution or sought formal recognition. It would explain their apparent indifference to political ideologies and religious doctrines, except insofar as these threaten knowledge preservation. If correct, this hypothesis suggests something remarkable. The network Morgan has glimpsed represents possibly the most successful long-term human project ever undertaken. Not the building of empires or religions, which rise and fall with historical cycles, but the maintenance of a continuous thread of knowledge preservation across millennia of human experience. The intelligence implications of such an organization are both profound and ambiguous. Its existence challenges fundamental assumptions about how human institutions function over time, yet its apparent lack of political objectives or hostile intent toward established governments makes it difficult to classify as a security threat. As the investigation continues, Morgan becomes increasingly convinced that this network, which still lacks a confirmed name in modern records, represents something intelligence agencies are poorly equipped to understand: a human institution operating on a timescale that transcends the nation-state itself. The clock clicks forward in the quiet of the analyst's office, surrounded by the accumulated records of civilizations rising and falling. Morgan confronts a troubling question: should this network, if it exists as hypothesized, be more thoroughly investigated, potentially disrupted, or the thought arises unbidden, protected? The analyst's dilemma has become something more profound than a question of intelligence assessment. It has become a philosophical question about knowledge, preservation, and the relationship between temporal power and eternal understanding. On the legal pad, a final note joins the others. They have survived the fall of empires. They may survive us as well. Alexandria, Egypt, present day. A programmer sits in a cafe overlooking the Mediterranean, laptop open to lines of code that would be meaningless to most observers. The programmer appears to be what they seem: a remote worker for a European tech company, enjoying the lower cost of living in Egypt while maintaining a Western salary. The cafe is busy with similar digital nomads, their conversations a polyglot mixture of technical jargon and travel recommendations. No one would notice that the programmer's coding patterns contain structures derived from ancient memory systems. No one would recognize that the seemingly random breaks they take to walk along the Corniche, to visit certain bookshops, to attend particular cultural events, form a pattern that, if mapped, would suggest the constellation Orion. No one would understand that when they meet other programmers, certain phrases exchanged amid technical discussions identify them as members of the same ancient brotherhood. The custode's cognition continues its work in the digital age, adapted as it has always adapted. Its members now include data scientists, ensuring that knowledge survives format obsolescence, librarians, digitizing vulnerable archives, systems architects, building redundancy into information networks. They preserve not just content, but context, the frameworks that make information meaningful, the connections that transform data into knowledge. And they remain largely unknown, as they have been for 2 millennia, largely, but not entirely. In a secure conference room at CIA headquarters, a senior intelligence official reviews a file that few have access to, fewer have read in its entirety, and almost none understand the full implications of. The file contains analyst Morgan's original report, now over 30 years old, along with subsequent investigations, historical analyses, and surveillance data. It has its own classification designation, one created specifically for this subject, a librarian, the official director of a division that doesn't appear on public organizational charts, speaks to 5 others, seated around the table. The question before us is not whether the custodes exists. We've verified their existence beyond reasonable doubt through multiple independent sources. The question is, what, if anything, we do with this knowledge. This meeting represents the culmination of decades of quiet investigation since Morgan first identified the pattern. The CIA, along with partner agencies in other countries, has gradually built a detailed understanding of the Brotherhood, its methods, its distribution, its historical development. This understanding remains imperfect, gaps existing where the custody's security measures have proven effective, but it's far more comprehensive than anything previously assembled. One attendee, head of technological intelligence, leans forward. Their digital preservation methods are decades ahead of our own. We've identified at least 3 major data storage innovations that originated within their network before entering commercial development. Their distributed verification protocols, especially those, could be valuable for our own archival systems. Another, representing counterintelligence, responds with characteristic suspicion, which raises the question of whether they're aware we're watching. Could these innovations be deliberately visible while they maintain more advanced methods we haven't detected? The director considers this possible, but inconsistent with their historical patterns. They've never shown interest in technological superiority for its own sake, only in preservation effectiveness. If they have more advanced methods, it's because those methods better serve their core mission, not to mislead observers. And what exactly is that mission? Asks a third attendee, newer to the librarian briefing than the others. After all this surveillance, do we actually understand what they're trying to achieve? The director nods to a civilian analyst, a historian seated at the far end of the table. This is unusual. Bringing non-intelligence personnel into such classified discussions rarely occurs, but a librarian has always operated under exceptional protocols. The historian speaks carefully, aware of the unusual environment. Based on all available evidence, their mission appears remarkably consistent with what we believe were their founding principles to ensure knowledge survives political, religious, and technological disruption. They're not trying to control this knowledge or restrict access, quite the opposite. They want it preserved and eventually made available, but only when it can be maintained independently of any single institutional framework. So they don't trust governments. The counterintelligence representative notes. They don't trust impermanent institutions, the historian corrects. Historically speaking, all governments are impermanent. The custodes appears designed to outlast any particular political system. This perspective, the intelligence implications of an organization designed to transcend the lifespan of nation-states themselves, has made Librarian one of the most conceptually challenging programs in CIA history. Traditional analytical frameworks assume that non-state actors ultimately seek to influence, undermine, or coexist with state power. An organization indifferent to the state as anything more than a temporary administrative arrangement requires different analytical approaches. The director redirects the conversation. The immediate question concerns our recommendations to the National Security Council. They've requested an assessment of whether the custodes represents a threat to U.S. interests, a potential asset, or a neutral factor. Opinions. The discussion that follows reflects the ambiguity inherent in evaluating a network like the custodes through national security frameworks. Those with technological backgrounds emphasize potential benefits from the Brotherhood's preservation methods. Counterintelligence specialists note risks associated with an organization operating outside governmental oversight. Regional experts discuss variations in how the network functions across different cultural contexts. Throughout, the historian remains largely silent, listening to intelligence professionals apply their analytical frameworks to an organization that predates those frameworks by millennia. When directly questioned, their responses emphasize the limited utility of evaluating the custodes primarily as a security concern, rather than as a unique civilizational phenomenon. As the meeting concludes, the director summarizes the consensus view that will be presented to the NSC. The custodes' cognition represents a non-state actor of unique historical continuity, operating globally with considerable technical sophistication, but without apparent political objectives that threaten U.S. interests. Continued observation is warranted, particularly regarding their digital preservation methodologies, which may offer valuable insights for our own information security protocols. This bureaucratic language, precise, measured, institutional, attempts to contain a phenomenon that inherently transcends bureaucratic categorization. The tension between the Brotherhood's temporal scope and the intelligence community's focus on immediate security implications remains unresolved. After the others depart, the director remains alone in the conference room, reviewing notes from the discussion. A separate file, accessible only to those with Librarian Prime clearance, remains unopened on the tablet. This file contains information shared with no one else, not even the meeting participants, evidence suggesting that the CIA's investigation of the custodes has not gone unnoticed by the Brotherhood itself. Not that they've taken hostile action or attempted to undermine the investigation. Rather, the evidence suggests something more subtle. They've accommodated it, adapted to it, incorporated awareness of intelligence interest into their operational security measures, just as they've adapted to every other shift in their environment over 2 millennia. More troublingly, certain patterns suggest they may have begun to identify and possibly recruit individuals within intelligence agencies themselves, not for traditional espionage purposes, but to ensure their preservation mission can continue even under modern surveillance conditions. The recruitment patterns mirror those observed in academic institutions, religious organizations, and commercial enterprises throughout history, identifying individuals with compatible values, gradually introducing brotherhood concepts through apparently unrelated discussions, eventual invitation to more formal participation. This raises profound counterintelligence concerns, but also a more fundamental question: how does one protect institutional security against an organization that thinks in centuries rather than budget cycles? How does one maintain information dominance over a network designed from inception to preserve knowledge through the collapse of empires? The director closes the file, understanding that these questions have no satisfactory answers within existing security frameworks. The librarian program will continue, monitoring, analyzing, occasionally interfering when the custode's activities intersect too directly with immediate national security concerns. But there is an unacknowledged recognition, reflected in the program's limited distribution and carefully circumscribed objectives, that complete understanding of the Brotherhood may lie beyond the intelligence community's grasp. What makes the custodes truly distinctive and truly challenging from an intelligence perspective is not any particular knowledge they preserve or method they employ, but their relationship to time itself. They operate on a scale where decades represent merely tactical adjustments, where centuries define strategic phases, where millennia provide the context for evaluating institutional success. This temporal perspective makes them simultaneously vulnerable and resilient. Vulnerable because their necessarily slow decision-making and preference for long-term stability can leave them exposed to rapid technological or political shifts. Resilient because these same characteristics allow them to weather disruptions that destroy more reactive organizations. They sacrifice immediate effectiveness for long-term continuity, immediate security for generational survival. In the digital age, this approach has led them to develop preservation methods that emphasize redundancy and format independence over efficiency. Where modern institutions optimize for current technological environments, the custodes design systems that can degrade gracefully through technological transitions, even catastrophic ones. The digital preservation protocols include provisions for reverting to analog methods, if necessary, maintaining the human knowledge required to rebuild digital systems from foundational principles. This civilizational fail-safe function, preparing for and preserving through worst-case scenarios, has gradually emerged as perhaps the Brotherhood's most significant contribution. Not the specific knowledge they maintain, though that remains valuable, but the meta-knowledge of how to preserve understanding through systemic collapse. It is this aspect that has led some within the intelligence community, including privately the director, to question whether the custodes might better be considered an asset to be protected rather than a potential threat to be monitored. In a world of accelerating technological change, increasing information vulnerability, and growing systemic risks, an organization designed specifically to maintain knowledge continuity through disruption becomes not just interesting, but potentially essential. Yet, this perspective remains minority. Institutional imperatives and security doctrines developed during the Cold War continue to shape how intelligence agencies approach non-state actors, even ones as unusual as the custodes. The Brotherhood is classified, categorized, analyzed within existing frameworks, even as those involved recognize the limitations of these approaches. As night falls over Langley, the director finalizes the report that will go to the National Security Council. The language is careful, the implications understated, the recommendations modest, nothing that would disrupt institutional expectations or suggest too radical a reconceptualization of how intelligence evaluates long-term phenomena. but an appendix, likely to be read by few, if any of the recipients, contains a more reflective analysis. It notes that the custode's continued existence represents something remarkable, a human institution that has survived virtually every political, religious, and technological revolution of the past 2 millennia. It suggests that such survival may indicate organizational principles worth studying beyond their immediate security implications, and it closes with a question that Morgan first posed decades earlier, a question that remains at the heart of the librarian program. Despite all subsequent investigation, what does it mean that the oldest continuously operating human organization appears designed not to achieve power, wealth, or territory, but simply to ensure that knowledge survives? This question, philosophical as much as operational, continues to trouble those few intelligence professionals aware of the Brotherhood's full scope and history. It suggests a possibility, both reassuring and unsettling, that beneath the visible churn of human affairs, the rise and fall of empires, the clash of ideologies, the disruption of technological revolutions, there exists a quieter continuity, a thread of preservation running through history, maintained not by dramatic gestures or powerful institutions, but by ordinary individuals committed to knowledge that transcends their own lifetimes. In Alexandria, the programmer closes their laptop as evening falls. They walk along the Cornic, following a path not unlike one their predecessors might have taken 2,000 years earlier. Tomorrow they will attend a meeting. 13 individuals gathering in a rented conference room, ostensibly for a tech meetup. The room will be unremarkable. The conversation seemingly focused on programming challenges and career opportunities. But at some point, a silence will settle among them, familiar, purposeful, weighted with historical continuity. And in that silence, something ancient will continue, adapting as it has always adapted, preserving as it has always preserved. The secret society that was never meant to be found continues its work, known now to intelligence agencies, but still largely invisible to the world it moves through. The centuries turn, empires rise and fall, technologies emerge and become obsolete, and through it all, knowledge flows, unbroken,